Welcome, everyone. I'm Mona Ateya. I'm the director of the Institute for Middle East Studies here at the George Washington University. And I'm delighted to have you join us today to discuss an Elusive Commons, a conversation between Max Eil and Karen Rignall. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Christian Clinton for all of his work with logistics, and Elad Raymond for working on the publicity, and Shana Marshall, who is the Associate Director of the Institute and will be moderating today's discussion. Dr. Rignall is a cultural anthropologist and assistant professor at the University of Kentucky, and she specializes in rural community development in Appalachia and North Africa. Prior to her doctoral studies, she actually ran a nonprofit national network of Arab American community-based organizations that provided support, funding, and skills training to groups serving their communities in the height of 9/11's anti-Arab backlash. She's also served as the country director of Morocco for the Near East Foundation, which is a rural community development organization focused on capacity building of local development associations, rural livelihoods, and community health-based initiatives. Her book, An Elusive Commons, which I think Christian will share a link to in the chat, is published by Cornell University Press and is based on years of fieldwork in the Magoon Valley. And we're joined today also by Dr. Eil, who's an associate researcher with the Tunisian Observatory for Food Sovereignty and the Environment and a postdoctoral fellow with the Rural Sociology Group at Wageningen University. I'm sure I butchered that. He's written for Monthly Review, Jacobin, and Viewpoint, contributed to numerous journals, including the Journal of Peasant Studies, the Review of African Political Economy and Globalization. And he's also an associate editor at the Agrarian Southern Journals, Labor and Society. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us today. The format of the event is really a conversation between the scholars, followed by question and answer, as I said, moderated by Dr. Marshall. So I am going to hand the floor to Dr. Rignall to introduce the book and just give us a little overview of the book. Thanks so much for joining us.
And I want to begin by thanking IMIS, all of the people who Mona just thanked, Christian, Ala, Shana, but especially Mona, who has supported this research writing and then the publication of the book also for a long time. And I also want to thank you, Max, for asking me hopefully some tough questions. I admire your work and I'm excited to engage in this dialogue about issues that we both care a lot about, and I hope others here do too. So in this book, I tell a story of a half century of agrarian change, social and also political change in one oasis valley in southeastern Morocco. I want to ask larger questions about land and indirectly food sovereignty, and what it means to live a rural life in a peripheral place such as the Magoon Valley. And I use that term periphery in a kind of sense. And so briefly, I hope, the summary will just introduce and set the tone for our discussion. I describe how insertion into the national and global political economy, political changes associated with French colonialism and then the post-colonial Moroccan state, and then finally labor migration, disrupted a racialized system of sharecropping in the Magoon Valley. And that's the sort of narrow entree into a broader set of issues. This sharecropping system indentured Black Amazigh or Berber to white Amazigh or Amazirin, and it excluded the Blacks from political power and land ownership. But again, there is a broader mosaic of changes that I address, and I specifically look at three main themes. First, the ways governance of communal land brings customary law, state power, and other forms of authority together, often in conflict. Second, what are the changes in how people farm? What do those changes tell us about communal governance of land and social life? And then thirdly, how the changes in the ways people make a living both support collective life and produce new forms of inequality. So this is a story that has been told in various forms in scholarship on the region. as well as in poetry, song, and story within the Southeast and other rural areas in Morocco. I situate this history and debates within critical agrarian studies and also political ecology about the fate of smallholder farmers in the context of global economic and environmental change. So I argue for the viability of rural life and the persistence of peasant lifeways and livelihoods. And we can talk about the use of the term peasant too, specifically in this part of Morocco. I try to avoid an unbridled optimism, however, about the ecological wisdom or inherently democratic or sustainable nature of rural communal governance or land use. And I also hesitate to make generalizations, even about other southeastern oases in Morocco. But I do hope to raise questions that other observers of rural life in Morocco, North Africa, Middle East in general, even arid lands, might also want to ask to understand rural political economies in the contemporary climate. And I also argue for a critical but nonetheless sympathetic rethinking of the role of commoning or the commons in rural politics and land governance. And I hope we'll get into that in our discussion. So just one final thought as we before we move to Max's questions. I know that books assume a life of their own as readers pick out the insights and theoretical gestures that move them, but I didn't expect this to be as true for the author as well. This is my first book. The book has informed my current work in ways I hadn't expected in the research and writing. So I'm not now working on strictly agrarian issues, even if my heart does actually lie in spending time in the fields. My current research compares the social and political dynamics of copper mining with large-scale solar energy in the same region in Morocco, but it draws fundamentally on what I learned about rural politics in the writing of the book. I learned about the diverse forms of political agency that can remain invisible without long-term engagement, ethnographically and otherwise, and a broader perspective on what social mobilization can look like. So I've through this experience of writing, I've come to understand the different temporalities and objectives people in the region have for their political agency and mobilization. And so hopefully we'll be able to turn to that current situation at the end of our dialogue. So I look forward to your questions and collectively and yours, Max.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to comment on this book. Small bits and pieces I've been very happy to see in various colloquia over the years and in journal articles and in discussing airports a little bit at 2 a.m. flights from Beirut and so forth. So I was surprised in the best way by the book, actually, because it's towards the end, I think, that some of the actual quantitative rural political economy comes out, which we don't find very much these days in a lot of political economy. What a lot of things that are called political economy don't actually talk about, get into the nitty gritty of field surveys about rural political economy, particularly in the Arab region. So I have some questions about that, which aren't my first questions, but I actually just wanted to note that I really, I thought the breadth of the book, theoretically and methodologically, was very impressive. It's going from the ecology, even the ecology side of political ecology, to examining and deconstructing French colonial and contemporary Moroccan governmental interventions, and then going on to contemporary social reproduction, although not a term you really use. Another question, which I hope to ask if we have enough time. So anyway, it was very impressive. I won't have more than one or two tiny places where I'm going to push you a little bit. To start with, one place where I would like to hear more from you is to both expand about for everyone what you meant about the elusiveness of the commons in this text, and how you develop your criticism, which I think is fairly sharp, in my opinion, of a lot of the literature of the commons, which has emerged over the last 15 years.
Thank you. I mean elusive in a couple of ways, one in an empirical way, and then one in a more theoretical. I always want to say something that people can disagree with, so I'm glad you found it sharp. But the empirical side first, the commons are elusive here in Morocco, and I suspect most anywhere, because they can be easily romanticized in kind of historical accounts from various positionalities when they never really truly existed. So there is so much kind of historical inequality in collective land ownership and use in the southeastern pastoral lands and oases, that even though people who are very critical of sort of capitalist transformations and are very worried about the sort of privatization of collective lands, can often elide the fact that they never really worked as commons for a number of different reasons. One, because of those historical inequalities that were racialized, but not exclusively. They were gendered, and also based on inequalities in social reproduction. So outsiders, young people were excluded from the commons in a meaningful sense. They're also elusive in the sense that the French colonial government very early on wove and integrated communally owned lands in Morocco into the colonial apparatus. So it had long not operated in any form of egalitarian or communal sense, with a lot of caveats for how different the particular circumstances were over time. The second part of the elusive nature is the more sort of theoretical argument that I make, that because of this sort of really bleak moment in kind of global political economy, the commons have in many ways replaced a sense of community as a romantic ideal for a radical critique, or even in many cases a liberal critique of capitalism and privatization and neoliberalism. And I am very sympathetic with many of the foremost theorists of commoning now, and this is not true of everybody by any stretch. But I want us to think very critically about the role of kind of inequalities and managing inequalities as inherent to commoning. And that's something to recognize and work with rather than romanticize. So that's kind of.
So, I mean, following up on that, I think, and again, it's, I think your point here is simultaneously comes through both sharply and in an understated way, which is a hard tension to hold, I think. But one point you make towards the end of the book is that what is being produced here is a sustained form of, rests on a sustained form of inequality, right? And I mean, how do you see that running against the grain of some contemporary, more idealistic visions of food sovereignty? So what was your goal in lifting up the fact that this is still a system which is systematically producing inequality and exploitation?
Well, I think it's a way of centering peasants' agency and their own aspirations and political projects, rather than imposing a sort of idealist notion of the inherent egalitarianism, democratic nature, which can of small farming or peasants who are not usually simply subsistence farmers, and quite honestly, rarely ever have been. And so there are more narrowly in agrarian studies and some of the food sovereignty movements, there's a sense that the smallholder farmer is our way out of this contemporary morass of global industrial agriculture. And it's a huge burden for small farmers and all of their diversity to hold, and may not, in fact, also conform to the aspirations and kind of political projects of those rural residents. Nonetheless, there are important forms of communal governance, of liberatory projects that the people that I worked with really did promote. And in a very kind of pragmatic sense, also kind of worked with the emergent inequalities that developed as some have access to migration opportunities, some don't. Some continue to be excluded by a lack of access to land because of their ethnic status or racial status, and some don't. And so those inequalities are important to recognize, but it's also important to recognize that an entire system of very rigid racialized hierarchies was dismantled in a meaningful way. And this is another kind of goal that I had, is let's not get so focused on the property form that we need to have communally owned land, and that's going to inherently signify something participatory, inclusive, or democratic for small farmers, because sometimes those communal structures, in fact, can exclude. And what I found in the various conflicts that I followed in my time in the Magoon Valley is that sometimes enclosure actually worked to preserve new forms of communal governance that were more egalitarian than what came before. But we need to also be precise about how we use the term enclosure. So the kinds of enclosure I'm talking about were not the sort of freehold property form that we saw in industrializing England. It is a very encumbered, embedded property form that's very linked to customary law and communal forms of governance. And so we need to just really look at what we mean by collective governance, communal lands, and the commons.
Right. I mean, something I was super impressed by is this also that you managed to have this engagement with Mamdani's argument about indirect rule being the default rule of colonialism across much of rural Africa, and to really weave that into this account of political colonial governance in North Africa, which maybe is reflecting my ignorance, but I'm not sure I've seen before. It's something I've thought about a little bit in relationship to Tunisia and systems of colonial kind of local municipal governance within Tunisia. But I thought this engagement was super important. And I wonder if you can talk about how the colonial powers both mobilized these kind of political forms of neoconservatism, I don't know, to maintain power in the countryside, while at the same time often mobilizing a dismissal of the traditional forms of agriculture as a means of capitalist colonial modernization. Because I thought holding these two sides in tension and combining them, this was something else the book did just brilliantly.
Thank you. You're going to have to hold me to my answer to make sure that I respond. So first is the centrality of kind of colonial strategies of rule. This is very much a story of the legacy of colonialism and post-colonial redeployments of colonial logics of rule. And I know that it's a topic of some debate in Moroccan historiography, as some say, well, you know, this really wasn't a case of indirect rule. It was a sort of performance of respecting Moroccan political structures, but a real, expropriation of not only, property and livelihoods, and in fact, all out all out brutality and violence. So it's not simply symbolic. But I think when we turn to perspectives such as that of Mamdani for sub-Saharan Africa, and a lot of other anthropologists and historiographers of both English and French colonial rule in sub-Saharan Africa, that to me was a real framework for helping me understand those two things, a sort of purported indirect rule and the sort of brutality of expropriation are certainly compatible. And particularly in the case of communal lands in Morocco, in fact, preserving the structure of collective ownership was a key way to expropriate collectively held lands, both for French interests and for the benefit of rural notables who would then support French rule. And that was much more the case in the southeast of Morocco, which was not going to be colonized for capitalist or French industrial interests. But indirect rule essentially created the commons in order to dismantle it. That's a term that Pauline Peters, or a phrase that Pauline Peters, who's an anthropologist of Africa, and Dorothy Hodgson, they use this term, and Mamdani describes the same thing. That by creating these customary and leaders and structures and legal apparatus and bringing them into positive colonial law, you are fixing these systems and also creating the conditions for their dismantling. And I argue that they maintained, in many respects, this legal architecture throughout post-colonial Morocco because it served the post-colonial government and various private interests very well. We can get into recent changes in Moroccan law, but I think that that's pretty important. And those sort of quote unquote preservation of customary systems of rule are very compatible with this dismissal of smallholder oasis agriculture and just peasant life in general. And that's where some of the really great political ecology work that Diana Davis and others have done about the way environmental narratives throughout actually the global south, or actually all over the world, because it's the same kind of narratives that happen in Euro-American contexts too, that it's always those land users and owners who are antithetical to the capitalist project who are responsible for environmental degradation. And so there were narratives of decline, or declensionist narratives, as Diana Davis calls it, that have been predicting the end of oasis life and oasis agriculture before the French even arrived in the Southeast. And yet it stubbornly refuses to die. And the reason it refuses to die is not simply because people are nostalgic, which is a somewhat dismissive conclusion that some, even Moroccan observers make, is that people just farm because because their grandfathers do it, but they don't earn anything. And this is where I felt like the quantitative work that we did was really important, because we found it actually does have a very meaningful impact on people's livelihoods. You have to know what to count and what to look for. And so all of these various narratives that come from both colonial powers and modernizing projects, colonial and post-colonial, have basically served to create this sort of space of exception for sort of oasis residents who in many respects use that marginality as a space of maneuver too. I hope I answered your question.
No, absolutely. So I wonder if you could actually elaborate a little bit more, because first of all, this this empirical work of translating subsistence and other forms of production into quantitative numbers, that we could actually know what the contribution of agriculture was to total production, at least in an approximate sense. This is actually a very transgressive finding in a certain sense. I mean, I think it both accords with what we know, or what a lot of us know, who, like, if you just go around the countryside, you see a lot of people in a poor third world country, you see a lot of people doing a lot of things, and then you look at whatever the World Bank or the IMF has summoned up through their statistical agencies, relying on whatever government statistics they're gathering. They're like, oh, approximately 0.07%, 1 in 7 trillion percent of Moroccan GDP actually comes from agriculture. And you're like, okay, well, you can make anything true with statistics. So can you, but sometimes like you did, you tell the truth with statistics. So I was wondering if you could kind of elaborate on your findings, both methodologically and also what you actually found, because I think this is actually, for me, I mean, everyone will take a different thing from the book. For me, this was such a critical finding. So I think it's so important to share.
So glad. I've got a big smile because you're giving me space to geek out on the farming piece, and I didn't expect that. So I spent a lot of time doing ethnographic work following farmers, seeing exactly what you say. People are doing a lot of things, putting a lot of resources, both financial and otherwise. And it's not just, as I said, for nostalgia, nor is it simply to preserve social relationships and kind of political identities, even though that's important too, and I get into that. But I saw how critical it was to livelihoods, and this is also despite the fact that farmers time and again say, agriculture doesn't pay. I never do accounting. This is only baraka that makes me continue to do it. And I'm like, sure. Yet you live really well, in part because people are taking migration remittances, money earned from owning a taxi or cleaning cafes in a regional city, and they bring it back into agriculture. So in many respects, I knew what to ask in trying to quantify or get an empirical snapshot, because even though people don't make accounting, and actually few of us actually do, of all of the ways that money comes in and out of our household, they have a very, very detailed sense of the way they manage their resources. So I had an opportunity to work with an agricultural economist to do a household survey. And we took the household livelihood survey that the Moroccan government administers every 5 to 10 years. And we adapted it based on what I knew about households and farming. And because, as you say, if you simply administer this kind of generalized survey, you're simply going to miss so much of what people actually do. And so we really asked not only, how much money do you spend, but what are the sort of in-kind, non-quantifiable, non-market resources that you put into farming. What do you do with your production, not simply what you sell? And when we ask those much broader questions, including women's labor, which is rarely paid, although much more so now, and these non-market ways of exchanging both inputs and outputs in production, we got a very, very different picture. So I'm afraid I don't have the numbers in front of me, but we found, if you just account for what's marketed, agriculture serves as a pretty small percentage of household livelihoods. To impute a value to all of the labor that gets put in and the output and production that gets consumed and then distributed, then it was almost 40% of many households' livelihoods. And that doesn't even begin to account for the kinds of benefits that people have from engaging in farming for getting other jobs. So if you farm on someone's land, they're likely going to choose you as their plumbing apprentice. If you engage in labor exchanges, you are going to gain access to other people's donkeys or mules or tractors. And then importantly, things like zakat, ashur, people donate often even more than the 10%. And so there's a whole other economy of grain and other production that circulates throughout a community and beyond, that relates to very fundamentally to religious and social obligations. So when you look at it that way, agriculture absolutely is an important pillar of livelihoods, and has become even more so, I would venture, since I did this research, because farmers have broken the monopoly of the local rose producers and distributors, and are getting better prices, are establishing cooperatives. So in fact, people have been able to make more from farming in the past decade even. It was great fun, this research.
Yeah. Well, I think it's critically important because, in a lot of cases, we know as a true fact that agriculture makes up a much larger portion of, and also women's agricultural labor is such a huge portion of overall production and productive labor in global South societies, yet because, of course, of the quantification fetish, it becomes hard to establish that to people, right? And I guess one question which came to mind, which was a bit, is just kind of a query, was, it seemed to me there's very little engagement with these questions of women's unwaged labor and super exploitation, how this relates to overall patterns of accumulation. It just didn't, I was a bit surprised because it seems you come to the same conclusions anyway. So is this a choice, or what motivated that?
Yeah, I mean, I do make gestures to it in how I describe kind of women's just sort of essential role at various points, not only in sort of agricultural practice, but also in social reproduction in a broad sense, also similar to David Crawford's work in the sort of management and transfer of land, and then in some respects social governance. And then towards the end, I do some, as you say, gestures towards thinking about kind of women bristling also at this sort of unwaged role, and moving and advocating and pushing for waged labor. And it really was about trying to figure out how to produce a book and limiting my scope and getting it done. And so it was not for any reason because I somehow considered it either theoretically or empirically less important. I just needed to bound it. Yeah. But I am hoping to produce an article, at least on some of these questions, linking, in fact, some of the ethnography that does appear here with some side research I did on sex workers in the market town, and ways in which kind of informal and waged economies and networks of social care really do support each other and really kind of upend our ideas about propriety and women's kind of economic and social agency. So that's waiting to be done after the pandemic.
Right. I mean, I just think it's important because, we're only slowly, I mean, as you know very well, like it's a slow process to kind of reconstitute an agrarian political economy approach in general to the Arab region. And of course, very much lacking is the political economy of gender within the broader field of agrarian political economy in the Arab region. And so I think it would be, I think it's a valuable contribution in that sense too, that is, could productively be lifted up in further work. We're going to open it up to questions soon. So I wanted to push on one point in conclusion, to push a little bit. So, I mean, this elusive common, right? What I think is, from a normative perspective, from my normative perspective, what I think is very critical here is the lifting up the role of agrarian rural labor to the social reproduction of the society, right? Because it's chronically undervalued and therefore dismissed from a developmental perspective. So I think this, this is absolutely critical from a certain normative perspective, right? On the other hand, this question of remittances is tough to deal with, right? I mean, so it kind of raised two questions for me. One is how people themselves understand remittances and tourism as phenomena, like how people, if this came up in the work, how people themselves relate to these processes, what they're how they perceive them. I mean, of course, it's not, of course, people sending remittances know that they're being exploited and oppressed and have to leave their home to make money. Like, that's very obvious, but nevertheless, how they articulated it is what I'm interested in. And, the other thing is that something that I would have liked to see developed, and this is just where I push a little bit, is, towards, about 3/4 of the way through the book, we see kind of a constellation of forces. We see ecotourism, we see remittances, we see development aid, but I missed conceptualization of the macro relationship which ties these things together, right? I mean, these are neo-colonial forms of value flow, right? Like, ecotourism, I understand why people do ecotourism. It's not a criticism of why people in the South are creating arenas for ecotourism. It's not a critique of that, or remittances or whatever. But these processes rely on a north-south polarity, right? I mean, the North has to be wealthier than the South for ecotourists to come from the North to the South and for that to be profitable. And the wage level has to be higher in the North for remittances to come to the South. So, so here on the one hand, I thought there's a missing, or at least an underplayed conceptualization of what was going on there. And on the other hand, I mean, I think that's significant from weaving that into a liberatory perspective, right? In the sense that, what is the liberatory perspective on remittances? I mean, the remittances aren't going anywhere. And more broadly, no one has ever called for any country in the world anywhere to just remove themselves from world market relations, right? It's always been the case that even China, 49 to 78, was heavily involved in trade for what it needed, right? So it's a question of getting what you need while enhancing endogenous productive capacity. I mean, is that happening in a sense, or how can we see that? Is there a liberatory avenue involved with remittances, or is this really a stabilization and very important process of social reproduction under conditions of continued neocolonialism, or is it somewhere in between?
Probably somewhere in between is the non-committal answer. And I think because I really wanted to center the experiences and narratives of the people I was working with, that this ambivalence in both a subjective sense and then in a political economic sense of remittances and that form of exploitation really do come out. So in many respects, it was on a kind of individual, household, communal level, pretty liberatory to go and be fundamentally exploited in the Alsatian coal mines, because you were able to send money back, buy land that you could never have access to, and invest in kind of an image of what it meant to be a successful, politically important man. Usually these were largely men who I examined. There's a whole other discussion to happen about women's migration to Europe and Moroccan cities. And so for it, in many respects, people understood. I have one particular experience of someone that I feature, who I still follow and visit. And he said, I spent 18 years in the mines, never had an opportunity to learn any French because I couldn't get out. It was like a war. Every day was like a war. And yet has spent the last 25 years with a pension and experiencing what it means to have some kind of autonomy. So does this stabilize a certain kind of agrarian political economy whereby people's labor is fundamentally exploited for the sake of cheap labor? Absolutely. And yet it means more, and it has more complicated and overdetermined outcomes than that straightforward formulation would imply. And that people have created both kind of economic and political sort of spaces of maneuver and agency within that. And in many respects, it's a space that doesn't exist in other parts of Morocco, where land values are high, where productive possibilities are really quite high, and export agriculture has completely eaten up possibilities for smallholder agriculture. So people's sense of remittances, as ambivalent as a more theoretical assessment of it would be, people don't like being away from home, of the older generation that I spoke to. You know, every time I go back, I encounter yet more younger people who want to get the hell out of there. I mean, this is also something that, sure, younger people often want to migrate and to leave, but not everybody. And households are large enough to maintain a strong presence, and people come back. That's not true everywhere in Morocco or everywhere where there's such a strong migration economy. But it definitely was true and continues to be true here. And to be fair, households could never remain historically together and in the Tamazirt, in the valley. People always had to slough off household members that they couldn't sustain. And they have been migrating for a very, very long time. In the 1800s, people were migrating to Algeria to work on French farms from the southeast and to dig wells in other parts of Morocco and Algeria. So these are not new dynamics. And then just to your point, I appreciate, I think you're right. I didn't really conceptualize as much as I could have these sort of interrelations around these kind of contemporary macro processes and their link, in fact, to colonial inequalities within Morocco and then with France and Europe in general. And so I think I could have done more of that, but part of it was also intentional, is particularly when I saw the sort of unfolding of this UNDP project that I spent a lot of time talking about. So many kind of critiques of development, of ecotourism, of state presence, of neoliberal economic reforms as a sort of catch-all really provide so much power to these processes as really over determining people's experience of those rural economies. And I wanted to sort of flip it a little bit and really emphasize the extent to which some of these things kind of move in and out of people's strategies of consciousness and kind of political sensibility. Not to underplay the importance of this area's peripheral role to Morocco's, political economy and to Europe, and indeed there has been some commercial agriculture in the southeast, such as the exportation of watermelons, which is insane. I also wanted to really emphasize, bad development projects are not the only cause of everything going on here. So that's it. I always end my answers with like a trailing so, but yes, that's the end of my answer.
Great. Thanks. I think I'll take over, and we have a question in the chat, and then I'll move to Mona, who also has a question. So this comes from Bill Lawrence. He says, congratulations on the book. It's fascinating and obviously the fruit of incredible work over many years. He's wondering if you could paint a portrait of one of the contestations that make your core points. So that's the first part of his question. Second, he's wondering if you could talk about what an enclosure is and what it isn't, and also what that means for your argument. And then third, if you could say something about the gender context of the region, especially with so many missing young migrant men who are working far away, but contributing in various ways to home household economics, perhaps seasonally.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm so glad you can make it, Bill, and nice to hear from you. So kind of one of these contestations, this was definitely not in my research plan, but anthropologists are taught to just kind of follow follow things as we observe them. And so this kind of sort of one example that I'll raise just became such an important topic of conversation. I couldn't look away, right? And that was an enclosure of collective lands that happened along the national road, and really play off of some of these kind of, you know, what Max called macro processes. So there is a mechanism whereby investors can lease for 99 years, usually large tracts of land, 99 hectares, you know, from ethnic collectivities, another word for tribe. So one large olive farm had gotten started in one of these tribal confederation lands. And in the course of that project getting started on the other side of the highway, one day while I was there, bulldozers started getting to work, and people from those surrounding villages started to notice and said, no, we're going to stop this, and stop the bulldozer, and then divided up that land amongst themselves. And that created a big standoff with the Ministry of Interior, who's the sort of organ of government that enforces this particular form of land governance. So that conflict lasted, you know, about a month, and really was an interesting comment on these internal tensions and dynamics. Because what happened is the tribal representative signed off, was able to say, hey, no, this is my role as the sort of leader of our communally owned land. But this was a colonial position created, and they were not required to check in with local villages or people who would contest that. And so by virtue of enclosing this land, these rural communities basically said no to the Ministry of Interior, no to investment for commercial agricultural production, but also no to their purported communal representatives. So it is a form of enclosure, but not in the way that we would understand through reading Raymond Williams. And so by enclosure here, it in a very kind of literal sense, people built, you know, put cairns on the ground and built adobe walls and literally enclosed the land. It was not, however, the simple privatization and individualization of land tenure, because I describe in a lot of depth thick layers of customary law that determines who can use the land and how. And that's where I see some of the somewhat liberatory possibilities in the kinds of enclosures that I saw, is that it was in fact a way to and began as household access to land from people and outsiders, and including some women, not universally so, but to do so in a way that made sense for a reassertion of communal governance that was not subjected to rural notables or local Ministry of Interior officials. And perhaps I'll pass on your last question about, oh no, I talked a little bit about gendered labor, but you're specifically asking about migrant men. You know, it is so a part of household and family life to have people, to have kind of male workers gone for parts of the year and then come back for Ramadan, parts of Ramadan, and then the August vacation, that it has really been worked into kind of social dynamics and family dynamics and marital relationships. So men aren't really missing here in a meaningful sense, but you know, women have a strong sense that they're not supposed to, you know, they're not going to be spending most of the year with their particular spouses. But at the most successful households, are still households in which at least some brothers are there with their families. And it's rarely a case where you have just a woman by herself with her nuclear family. And so people, there's a lot of variation here, so it's tough to generalize, but the most successful households really didn't only have men contributing in economic ways. And just one final small point about that, here is where, in fact, the sort of relative marginality of this particular area kind of supported family kind of unification and continuity is, education levels are low. People are often day laborers, not going to Europe. So they're able to come back more often and maintain a presence. So even though their incomes may not be as high as people who have more professional jobs or in Europe, they actually are able to maintain their local presence a little bit more, both, and this gets back to your point, Max, in a very ambivalent way. They're poorer, but they have more autonomy perhaps as a result, and they're more exploited, but they're able to use that in certain ways.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Mona, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. Thanks, Karen. And congratulations on writing such a wonderful book and contribution. And I will never forget my first trip to the Magoon Valley was with you. And we went to visit El Hart, and you talk about it in the conclusion. So part of my question is, I'm going to ask you 3 questions and you can just pick which ones you want to answer. But did the El Hart Bridge, I know you were there really recently, did it ever get built, and did it get rebuilt better? And so generally, sort of from that, what is the role that you see of infrastructure in enabling these rural livelihoods? And that's something that I've been really interested in the past couple of years. And my next question is, again, based on, you talk a lot about the role of forms of political exclusion or forms of social mobilization. And I know that that's where your new project is going. So in reference to other forms, not necessarily land reform, but you mentioned solar and other extractivism. So could you share with us some of the forms of social mobilization that you witnessed in your recent visit, and how it might be telling us something about this special place, right? Not because we hear a lot about mobilization in the Reef, and when it's sexy. So what are the kind of unsexy forms of social mobilization that might have just as much of an impact? And then my last question was, you talk about commoning as having a part of the power is the way that it addresses the management of inequality. And so I wanted to ask you if you could share with us an example of the types of practices that are doing that type of work. Thanks.
Thanks for these great questions. I feel like the one about El Hart is perhaps the easiest. The bridge has been largely built. It wasn't complete when I was there in October, but they went back and they're building one of these pretty solid that will withstand the floods, and created a whole new road. And it's been fascinating to see the extent to which this one infrastructural project really does sort of support kind of incredible transformations. I wouldn't want to oversimplify and sound like some weird 1960s high modernist development official. But when you actually speak to people, they're like, we don't want the state messing in our business. The state is nothing but exploitative and repressive. Would they just build us a bridge when we ask for it? It's and so in people's imaginaries that I have encountered, infrastructure can be important, but as your work shows so sort of readily, Mona, it also is inherently appropriated and used for sort of doling out patronage or reinforcing inequalities. So it's tough, and infrastructure is a very sexy topic, I know, in anthropology these days. But But I think in a very kind of pragmatic way, it does end up being kind of really central to people's understanding of what the state should be doing for them. So I don't know if that's enough of an answer, but so maybe I'll move to the sort of social mobilization question. You're absolutely right. People who have both sort of academic observers, but also activists and some of the kind of political observers in sort of urban Morocco have really paid attention in the last 10 years to the rural mobilizations, and the state obviously has too. And the sexy ones really do attract a lot of attention. The social movements that kind of masterfully use some of those sort of global symbols, like the occupation of the sort of mountain next to the Emid silver mine, is a really masterful use of a lot of the kind of symbols and images of what social movements do. The unsexy things are the ones that really interest me, because those are the ones that are often really much more successful according to the standards of the people who are kind of engaging in them. So for the example of the silver mine, for those of you who are unfamiliar, the Southeast, mining is a much more important part of sort of Southeastern history and political economy than I understood, even for my 10 years of having done research there. But I just spent some time in the archives in October, and I was pretty astounded by my own ignorance about how central extraction and mining has been. So a silver mine has been working there actually since the Almohad period, but in the contemporary period has been mining silver with the attendant water draws and pollution, and resistance to that resulted in an 8-year-long occupation of this mountain. And that ended essentially in failure. Eventually people were sort of forced to go home, but it's not been a failure in the sense that this whole process, including some of the sort of social tendencies that were not very excited about the occupation, have been able to use these experiences to sort of train themselves in the sort of political culture of how to deal with different forms of authority, have been able to overturn communal elections, run for office without a romantic idea of what local democratic politics looks like. People understand the limitations, but these sort of slow changes are really important to people. And that's the kind of thing we're looking at in the sort of social dynamics around copper mine and solar energy is, what are the different modes of political action? And in fact, social movements are a tiny percentage of those, and rarely the most effective. So that's something that I'm kind of interested in thinking about and theorizing more. And I would need to think about those sort of commoning questions and how they kind of manage inequality. So maybe one example would be the kind of division of land that happened in this kind of mountain community. You actually, the Imzi, sort of next to Rabat Hamd, where you worked. So a community of formerly subjugated Black metal workers. I talk about this in the divide up an area of collectively owned land to prevent the state and rural notables from taking over that land. And they gave an allocation to all of the households. But not everybody can make use of this. Not everyone can invest in putting a storage facility there or creating a place to house animals. I'm forgetting even the English word for a kore, to keep the animal stable. And not everyone can set up a hanut or a store. And so it's an understanding that it's only people with access to remittances who are really going to be able to invest in these new forms of economic activity that have been created by this sort of enclosure. And yet there's somewhat of a brake that's put on this privatization of land, because there are limits on what you as a household are able to do with it. And you're not allowed to sell also the land outside of the community. And in general, there's a strong social opprobrium for selling, period. And so households who don't have that capacity, they're losing out for sure, but they're able to retain that property and do something with it, or wait until they can do something with it, or establish patronage relationships with families who do something with it. And so that may not create sort of opportunities for upward mobility for everybody, but there are also some brakes on say distress sales or polarization in that community. So I don't know if that.
Great, thanks. We do have another question. This one comes from Graham Cornwall. He says, also thanks for sharing your work. He says, you expressed some hesitance to generalize about the commons through your work in Laguna. Could you say why? Is there something in the physical geography or the actual material produce of the agriculture that sets it apart?
Yeah, well, I mean, part of this is, in fact, just the incredible diversity and sort of social and economic and sort of political kind of structures, as I said earlier, even from valley to valley in the Southeast. And there are some kind of key elements that have enabled, I think, some of these sort of land conflicts and land contestations to end in ways that I think are perhaps more egalitarian. And that is in part because this land doesn't tend to have a high economic value for export or other kind of capital intensive or kind of market oriented agriculture, at least in a bigger sense. So part of that is about the physical geography, the availability of water, the particular lay of the land. And part of it too is in what I mentioned earlier, the Macun Valley kind of hit this sort of sweet spot. Well, that's a wrong term, because it's a spot of marginalization and kind of an exploitation in certain respects, because it's doesn't have a huge tourist economy like a few valleys over. It doesn't have export watermelon agriculture. And that's what's kind of created the possibility for some upward mobility without the kinds of pressures that come with sort of capitalist transformation of the agricultural sector. And then it's also not really applicable because not applicable to the more kind of agriculturally productive in the sort of neoclassical economic sense areas, such as in the plains that were really integrated into kind of the colonial economy. And so even there, it becomes even more difficult to talk about kind of communal governance in the way that I talk about here. So because I have encountered people who work in the Gharb or in other parts of Morocco who are like, you're talking crazy talk. This is, people have been dispossessed of their land forever. Like, well, not everywhere. And so it's less that we need to then take this as a kind of microcosm of what happens everywhere, but it does ask us to ask particular questions. Assume that we know what's going on. So similar to Max's questions about agricultural production, before we assume we know, we need to just really make sure that we understand what the political or economic implications of the moves people are making.
Great. That's all the questions that I've seen in the chat. Max, do you have, did that prompt, those exchanges prompt any additional questions for you? We have about 7 minutes left. You're muted, Max.
Correct. Do any people have questions that they didn't type out in the audience?
I don't see any hands raised.
I could keep on talking, don't worry.
I mean, I don't know how good this question is. Oh, Bill Lawrence raised his hand. Bill, do you want to ask a question? Bill?
I want to hear Shayna's question, but I'll keep it quick. Could you just talk about your selection of Maguna, because it has its own peculiar economy, regionally, and you made a couple of references to what's different about other areas, but can you just talk about why you selected that particular community to focus on?
Honestly, I had a friend who knew somebody and could introduce me to the key people, which ended up being sort of so fundamental for my ongoing work, and really connected me to this wonderful network of civil society and human rights activists. So there was that. And then, it was a rural place that was an hour or so away from a regional hospital. And I was taking my 2 preschool kids and wanted to be close enough, but still in a rural area. And so Magoon kind of fit the bill, and I could get an internet connection so that my spouse could write his second book.
Perfect. Shayna.
Yeah.
I know that graduate students especially always really appreciate honest answers like that, because they think that their research side is supposed to be derived from some sort of complex formula, and it often comes down to funding and sort of lifestyle and living questions. So that's really great, Karen. Thank you. My question you might have answered it a little bit in one of the previous exchanges, but I was wondering what kinds of specific, if you have examples of the customary laws or the customs or norms that accompanied the incidents of enclosure that you witnessed or that you had recounted to you, if there were specific sort of relationships or laws other than maybe the ones from the colonial period, the sort of identification of, tribal leaders who would become the sort of de facto spokespersons for their communities.
Well, thank you for, not only do I like geeking out about farming, but also about customary law, because that was really a joy of mine to sort of unravel. So there are so many layers, and there were 2 layers in particular that really mattered for the way these politics unfold, and that I don't often really see addressed in some of the other treatments of collective lands in Morocco. And that's that the laws I'm talking about that were kind of developed as a part of the colonial kind of project were really about collectively owned land at a sort of larger scale, the larger tribal confederations. I mean, we could get into that because they never really quite defined it, which is also something that Mamdani kind of talks about as inherent to the project of indirect rule. But when you kind of actually get to these places, then you actually see the extent to which there are so many different systems that interlock. And so at the village level, there are collectively owned lands. And then there's a sort of customary boundary. It's never been codified either through customary authorities historically or even through the colonial project, between the boundary between village lands and then the tribal confederation of which that village may be a part. And so a lot of these politics that I address involve those relationships of NOWEB, the collective land representatives at the village level, and the important power that they have as leader of their Shema, the small, historically a sort of tribal governing council. Over time, as the state has come in and established its sort of territorial presence, other functions of these tribal councils, and I really hate the word tribal, but that's the term that we have, and these collective land representatives. So many of the functions, of the councils have been appropriated by the state, really leaving the collective land representatives as some of the most important political figures. And they draw on these kind of historically sort of articulated and really diverse practices that can differ very substantially from community to community, confederation to confederation, based on relations of power and just convention, about everything from where irrigation canals can be built, where you can farm, where you can build housing, who has access to the communal lands that surround it, habitation, who has access to the fields after harvest has been done. And there are some places where these rules have completely fallen apart. And then there are other places where, in fact, those rules have become more elaborated in the last kind of half century. And that's, I mean, that really was kind of a major argument that I kind of understand is pretty specialized and of limited interest. But for many scholars of sub-Saharan Africa, this is a really important customary kind of legal mechanisms and practices are not going away. And in fact, can often become more powerful and elaborated because of higher land values or insertion into a kind of capitalist agriculture. And the anthropologist has been really, really formative for me on this. I really admire the work of Jane Geyer, and she's been able to really trace this, the ways in which customary law is also not only regressive, not only a way for local repression, but just as an important political tool.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We're right almost at 12:15. And Mona had to slip out. So I'll go ahead and thank everyone. Thank you so much, Karen. This book sounds wonderful. Christian has put the links to buy the book and then also to view the recording of the event in the chat box. And I think there's a discount code also, right, for the book. I think that
is.
Yeah, that was linked at the very beginning also. Thanks, Max, so much for being such a gracious discussant. There's the great copy, beautiful cover. Thanks everyone so much. Thanks, Christian. Thanks to everyone for attending today. Our next event will be on January 27th about Turkey as a model of Muslim authoritarianism with Halil Yenegoon from UVA and a discussant Marlene Laruelle from GW. Thanks everyone again. Wonderful discussion, and see some of you at the end of this month. Thanks so much.